The morning sun peeked through the blinds as 78-year-old Dorothy Jenkins carefully packed her small suitcase. Her fingers, though now showing age spots and slight arthritis, moved with purpose. She tucked in a framed photo of her granddaughter in a graduation cap, the reason for her trip today. Dorothy wasn't like most airline owners. While other big shots flew in private jets or at least first class, she preferred to blend in with regular folks. Today, she was catching flight SL 477 from Atlanta to Chicago, sitting in economy class like she always did. "Can't know how your business really runs if you don't see it through your customers' eyes," she often told her staff, though most newer employees had no idea what the founder of Skyline Airways looked like. Dorothy had built her airline from nothing. Back in the 1980s, after being turned down for loans by 12 different banks, she'd scraped together enough money to buy 2 small planes. Now Skyline was the 5th largest airline in the country, worth billions. As she dressed for her flight, Dorothy chose comfort over flash: simple navy pants, a light blue button-up shirt, and her favorite cardigan. The only hint of her wealth was the watch on her wrist, a gift from her late husband on their 40th anniversary. She tucked it mostly under her sleeve. Her gray hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore practical walking shoes for navigating the airport. "Another day of just watching," she said to herself, slipping her worn leather notebook into her purse. That notebook contained years of observations, everything from how long passengers waited for their bags to how staff treated people who didn't look rich or important. Dorothy locked her modest home and called a rideshare to the airport. The driver was surprised when she gave him the economy parking area as her destination rather than the drop-off zone. "You sure, ma'am? It's a long walk to the terminal from there," he said, looking at her through the rearview mirror. Dorothy smiled. "I like to stretch my legs. Besides, walking lets me see things." The driver shrugged and dropped her off. Dorothy paid the fee for long-term parking and made her way toward the terminal, blending in with the morning crowd of travelers. No one gave her a second glance, just another elderly woman traveling alone. Inside the bustling airport, Dorothy observed everything. She noticed how a gate agent rushed a young mom with crying twins through boarding while making others wait. She spotted a janitor going the extra mile to help a lost child find his parents. These were the kinds of details that most executives missed from their corner offices. As she approached the Skyline Airways gate, Dorothy felt a mix of pride and curiosity. This was her creation, her life's work. Yet she knew from experience that seeing her airline through a passenger's eyes often revealed truths that reports and meetings couldn't show. She stood in line with everyone else, boarding pass in hand. The gate agent barely looked at her, waving her through with hardly a word, while chatting warmly with a man in an expensive suit just ahead. Just another Tuesday, Dorothy thought to herself with a small smile, making a mental note. On the jet bridge, she paused to let an elderly gentleman with a cane go ahead. He nodded gratefully. Dorothy took a deep breath before stepping onto the plane. These undercover trips always gave her butterflies, even after all these years. There was something both thrilling and nerve-wracking about watching your own company at work when nobody knows who you are. She glanced at her boarding pass, seat 23C, middle seat, economy class. Perfect for observing the full flight experience. As she made her way down the aisle, Dorothy had no idea that this routine observation flight was about to become anything but ordinary. Today would test not just her airline's service, but her own dignity, patience, and ultimately, her vision for the company she had built from the ground up. Dorothy made her way down the narrow airplane aisle, careful not to bump other passengers with her small carry-on bag. Her seat, 23C, was in the middle row, not the most comfortable spot, but perfect for observing how her staff treated regular customers. As she approached her row, Dorothy noticed a flight attendant named Renee watching her. Something in the young woman's gaze made Dorothy pause. It wasn't warmth or welcome she saw there. "Excuse me," Dorothy said politely to the businessman in the aisle seat who was busy typing on his laptop. He sighed loudly but stood up, barely making space for her to squeeze past. Just as Dorothy was about to place her small carry-on in the overhead bin, Renee stepped forward. "That bag needs to be checked," she said sharply, despite there being plenty of room in the bin. A businessman across the aisle had just placed a much larger bag in the compartment without any comment from the same flight attendant. I believe it fits the requirements, Dorothy replied calmly. And there seems to be enough space. Renee's voice grew louder, drawing attention from nearby passengers. People like you need to follow the rules. That bag has to be checked. Dorothy felt a familiar tightness in her chest, not from fear or even anger, but from the weary recognition of something she'd experienced countless times before. Even at 78, even after building an airline worth billions, she was still just people like you to some folks. What exactly do you mean by people like me? Dorothy asked quietly. The businessman next to her snickered and muttered something under his breath. A woman across the aisle looked uncomfortable and turned away. Renee didn't answer Dorothy's question. Instead, she reached for the bag. I'll take this now. An older flight attendant named Tom approached, sensing the tension. Is there a problem here? Before Renee could speak, Dorothy addressed him directly. There seems to be confusion about whether my bag fits the requirements. It's the same one I've traveled with for years. Tom glanced at the bag, then at the half-empty overhead bin. That's clearly fine, ma'am. Please, go ahead and store it. Renee's face flushed, but she stepped back without another word. Dorothy thanked Tom and settled into her seat, pulling out her small notebook once she was settled. As the plane filled with passengers, Dorothy observed how differently Renee treated various people. Young professionals received warm smiles and offers of help with their bags. A couple wearing designer clothes was directed to extra space for their numerous carry-ons. Meanwhile, an elderly Asian man was curtly told to hurry up, and a mother with a fussy baby received eye rolls rather than assistance. When the drink service began, Dorothy watched as Renee moved efficiently through the cabin, chatting with some passengers while barely acknowledging others. When she reached Dorothy's row, she served both men with a smile but placed Dorothy's water on her tray without a word or even eye contact. The businessman beside Dorothy knocked her elbow as she reached for her drink, causing water to spill on her cardigan. Sorry, he mumbled, not sounding sorry at all. Dorothy dabbed at the water with a small napkin. She pressed the call button to ask for another napkin, but no one came. After 5 minutes, she pressed it again. Still, no response. From across the aisle, a young woman noticed what was happening. She leaned over and offered Dorothy her unused napkins. Thank you, dear, Dorothy said with genuine gratitude. No problem. I've been watching how they're treating you. It's not right, the woman whispered. Dorothy smiled. I've seen worse, believe me. Doesn't make it okay, the young woman replied. She introduced herself as Lynn, a new employee at a tech company heading to Chicago for training. As they chatted quietly, Dorothy noticed Renee watching them with narrowed eyes. When the food service began, Lynn's special meal was mysteriously missing, while the businessman next to Dorothy received an extra dessert for the inconvenience of sitting next to her. Dorothy wrote everything down in her notebook, not with anger, but with purpose. Each incident, each slight, each moment of poor service was carefully documented. Not just what happened to her, but what she observed happening to others. This wasn't just about one bad flight attendant. Dorothy had seen this pattern before. It was about systems, training, and culture, things she had the power to change. If only they knew who was watching. What Dorothy didn't realize was that she wasn't the only one watching the situation unfold. In seat 12, a sat Roy Chen, recently hired as Skyline's new director of customer experience. Like Dorothy, Roy was traveling incognito, part of his self-designed training to understand the real passenger experience. Roy had noticed the interaction between Dorothy and Renee during boarding. At first, he wasn't sure if he was imagining things. Maybe the flight attendant was just having a bad day. But as the flight progressed, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Unbelievable, he muttered under his breath as he watched Renee skip Dorothy during the second beverage service while offering refills to everyone else in her row. Roy made notes on his phone, planning to include this in his first report. He had no idea he was documenting his boss's experience. Across from Dorothy, Lynn pulled out her phone and discreetly started recording when Renee accidentally bumped Dorothy's arm with the drink cart, then walked away without apologizing. "Are you okay?" Lynn asked Dorothy quietly. "Just fine, dear," Dorothy replied with a gentle smile. "Been through worse than a little bump." Lynn frowned. "I'm posting this. My followers need to see how Skyline treats certain passengers. You have many followers? Dorothy asked with genuine curiosity. About 3 million across my platforms, Lynn said casually. I usually post about tech and travel. Dorothy's eyes widened slightly. In her day, getting a message to 3 million people would have required a national TV broadcast. Now this young woman could do it with a tap on her phone. In first class, a tall man in a tailored suit glanced back toward Dorothy's row. Gregory Washington, Skyline's chief financial officer, was traveling to Chicago for the same finance meeting Dorothy planned to attend afterward. Unlike most executives, Gregory knew what the founder looked like. He'd been with the company for nearly 20 years, starting as an accountant when Skyline had just 10 planes. Gregory's blood ran cold as he watched Renee's behavior toward Dorothy. He started to get up, ready to intervene, when his seatmate, another executive who knew nothing about who Dorothy was, put a hand on his arm. Flight attendant said we need to stay seated, the man explained. Some minor turbulence ahead. Gregory reluctantly sat back, his jaw tight. He'd known Dorothy since he was a young man starting his career. She'd given him a chance when other companies had turned him away because of his background. Now he was watching her being treated like she didn't matter on her own airline. Meanwhile, in coach, the businessman sitting next to Dorothy continued his rude behavior. When Dorothy politely asked him to let her pass so she could use the restroom, he made a show of heavily sighing and slowly gathering his things. Some people shouldn't travel if they can't sit still, he mumbled, loud enough for those around to hear. An elderly white couple across the aisle exchanged uncomfortable glances. The husband leaned forward. Excuse me, sir, he said firmly. That's no way to speak to a lady. The businessman rolled his eyes. Mind your own business, old man. Dorothy placed a gentle hand on the kind man's arm. It's all right. Thank you for your concern. On her way back from the restroom, Dorothy noticed Roy watching the situation. There was something about how carefully he was observing that made her wonder if he might be a reporter. Skyline had been getting good press lately for their expansion plans. As Dorothy settled back in her seat, she felt something unusual, a sense that this particular flight might turn out differently than her others. There were too many people watching, too many witnesses to the small indignities she was experiencing. When the flight hit a patch of turbulence, Dorothy's reading glasses fell from her tray table and skidded under the seat in front. Renee, passing by, simply stepped over them without offering help, though she stopped to pick up a dropped napkin for a younger passenger just ahead. Lynn, still recording discreetly, caught this moment too. Her face showed growing anger, but Dorothy's remained calm. She'd learned long ago that keeping her composure was sometimes the most powerful statement she could make. What none of them knew was that in less than an hour, everything would change. The plane was already beginning its descent into Chicago's O'Hare Airport, and with it would come a reckoning none of them expected, especially Renee. The plane began its final approach to Chicago, but the unpleasant journey was far from over for Dorothy. As the captain announced they'd be landing in 20 minutes, Renee began collecting trash, moving through the cabin with brisk efficiency. When she reached Dorothy's row, Renee held the garbage bag open for the businessman by the window and nodded politely to him. She did the same for the passenger on the aisle. But when Dorothy held out her empty cup and wrapper, Renee had already moved on, deliberately ignoring her. "Excuse me," Dorothy called gently. "You missed my trash." Renee turned back with a cold stare. "I'll come back around," she said, though they both knew she wouldn't. Dorothy placed her trash neatly on her tray table and sat back, her face revealing nothing of her thoughts. But her hand moved steadily in her notebook, recording yet another incident. Lynn leaned across the aisle. "I can take that for you when she comes back," she offered. "Thank you, dear," Dorothy replied. "But it's important that I see how this plays out." The businessman beside Dorothy glanced at her notebook. "Writing a complaint?" he asked with a smirk. "Good luck with that. These airlines don't care about anything except money." Dorothy gave him a small, mysterious smile. You might be surprised what some airlines care about. As the plane descended through clouds, Dorothy gazed out the small portion of window she could see from her middle seat. Chicago's skyline came into view. A city where she'd opened Skyline's second hub 30 years ago against the advice of industry experts who said it would never work. The landing was smooth, something Dorothy always appreciated and made a note to compliment. Whatever else was happening on this flight, her pilots were doing their jobs well. The plane taxied to the gate, and passengers began the familiar ritual of standing too early, pulling bags from overhead bins, and cramming the aisle. Dorothy remained seated in no rush. She watched as Renee helped certain passengers with their luggage while ignoring others who clearly needed assistance. An elderly gentleman struggled with a heavy bag while Renee chatted with a young man in an expensive suit. Gregory Washington, the CFO from first class, made his way back through the cabin against the flow of departing passengers. His tall frame and determined expression caused people to step aside. He'd been seething throughout the flight, watching from a distance as the company's founder was treated poorly. When he reached Dorothy's row, he had to wait as the aisle cleared. The businessman next to Dorothy pushed past her roughly to join the departing crowd, not bothering to apologize when he stepped on her foot. Finally, Gregory reached her. "Miss Jenkins," he said respectfully, his deep voice carrying, "I didn't know you were on this flight. Do you need any assistance with your Chicago arrangements?" At the sound of Dorothy's last name, Renee froze in the aisle a few rows ahead. Something about the way the well-dressed man had addressed the elderly woman sent a chill down her spine. "Thank you, Gregory," Dorothy said warmly. "I'm fine, but it's good to see you. Will you be at tomorrow's meeting?" "Wouldn't miss it," he replied, then lowered his voice. "Miss Jenkins, I observed some concerning service issues during this flight." Dorothy nodded. "As did I. We have much to discuss." Renee approached cautiously, her earlier coldness replaced by growing anxiety. "Is there something I can help with?" she asked, her eyes darting between Gregory and Dorothy. "Actually," Gregory began, his tone professional but cool, "I'd like to introduce you to someone. This is Dorothy Jenkins." Renee's face showed no recognition. Gregory continued, founder and majority owner of Skyline Airways. The color drained from Renee's face. Around them, the deplaning passengers who overheard this revelation froze. Lynn, who was just about to exit, spun around, her phone still recording. "The owner?" Renee stammered, her voice barely audible. Dorothy stood up slowly, her 5'3" frame somehow filling the space with quiet dignity. "I believe you mentioned you'd come back for my trash," she said simply, holding out her empty cup. The silence that fell over the nearby passengers was complete. Everyone waited to see what would happen next. The moment hung in the air like a paused movie. Renee stood frozen, her mouth slightly open, as she processed what Gregory had just said. The owner? This elderly woman she had been treating poorly for 3 hours was the owner of the entire airline. I didn't," Renee stammered, her face flushing deep red. Dorothy simply looked at her, cup still extended, her expression neither angry nor triumphant, just patient. "Ms. Jenkins, I had no idea," Renee finally managed, taking the cup with shaking hands. "That's rather the point," Dorothy replied quietly. "None of your passengers should be treated the way you treated me today." By now, word was spreading through the remaining passengers like wildfire. People who had been rushing to exit suddenly found reasons to move more slowly, watching the drama unfold. Lynn stepped forward, still recording. "Ma'am, you're Dorothy Jenkins?" The Dorothy Jenkins who started with 2 planes in the 80s and built Skyline into what it is today. Dorothy turned to her with a warm smile. "That's me, though the story sounds more impressive when someone else tells it." The airline's founder turned back to Renee. "I'll need to speak with your supervisor. Not to get you fired," she added, noting the fear in Renee's eyes, "but because what happened today points to bigger issues we need to address." Roy Chen, the customer experience director, who had been watching from a distance, approached now. "Miss Jenkins, I'm Roy Chen. I just started with Skyline last week." He extended his hand, his expression a mix of awe and embarrassment. "I was on this flight specifically to observe our service standards." "Well," Dorothy said with a small smile, "I suppose you got quite an education today." "I'm mortified," Roy admitted. "This is not what I expected when I joined Skyline." The plane was almost empty now, with just a handful of fascinated passengers lingering to watch. The captain emerged from the cockpit, confused by the delay in deplaning. "Is there a problem?" he asked, then did a double take when he spotted Dorothy. Unlike most staff, pilots regularly attended meetings with the board and senior leadership. Ms. Jenkins, we had no idea you were aboard. Captain Rivera, Dorothy greeted him with genuine warmth. The flight itself was excellent, smooth takeoff, perfect landing. My compliments to you and your co-pilot. The captain beamed, then looked uncertainly at the tense group around him. Is everything okay? We've had some service issues, Gregory explained diplomatically. Ms. Jenkins experienced treatment that falls well below our standards. Captain Rivera's smile faded as he looked at Dorothy with concern. I'm sorry to hear that. Anything I can do? Actually, yes, Dorothy said. Could you arrange for Mr. Chen, Ms. Renee, and myself to use your crew lounge for a brief meeting? I believe we have some important matters to discuss before I head to my granddaughter's graduation. Of course, the captain replied immediately. I'll make sure it's ready for you. As they moved toward the exit, the elderly couple who had defended Dorothy earlier stopped to speak with her. We had no idea who you were, the woman said, but we sure didn't like how you were being treated. Been flying Skyline for 20 years because we thought you folks were better than the other airlines. Dorothy took the woman's hand. We try to be. And after today, I promise you we'll try even harder. Lynn, who was still recording, asked, Ms. Jenkins, can I share your story? People need to hear this. Dorothy considered the request. Throughout her career, she had avoided publicity, preferring to work behind the scenes. But perhaps it was time for a different approach. Yes, she decided, share it. Sometimes the best way to fix problems is to bring them into the light. As they walked through the jet bridge, Dorothy's phone buzzed with a text from her granddaughter. Where are you, Grandma? Did your flight land? Dorothy typed back with a smile. Just arrived. Had an interesting flight. Can't wait to see you, but I need to take care of something important first. This is what real leadership looks like, showing up when things go wrong, not just when everything's perfect. She put her phone away and straightened her shoulders. At 78, Dorothy Jenkins wasn't looking for new challenges. But if one found her, well, she'd never been one to walk away from important work. By the next morning, Lynn's videos had spread across the internet like wildfire. Millions of views, thousands of comments, and dozens of news outlets picking up the story. Airline owner experiences discrimination on her own plane, read the headlines. Dorothy hadn't planned on becoming a viral sensation in her late 70s, but as she sat in her hotel room watching her phone light up with notifications, she knew this moment could become something meaningful. Ms. Jenkins, the press is asking for statements, said Putty, her assistant of 20 years, who had flown in early that morning. And the board is in panic mode. Mr. Washington has called an emergency meeting for this afternoon. Dorothy nodded, sipping her tea. Tell them I'll be there. But first, I have a graduation to attend. 3 hours later, Dorothy sat proudly watching her granddaughter Zoe walk across the stage to receive her engineering degree. Tears filled her eyes as the young woman who represented the future of their family accepted her diploma with a bright smile. That's my grandbaby, Dorothy whispered to the stranger next to her, who smiled politely, having no idea he was sitting next to the woman dominating social media that day. After the ceremony and a celebratory lunch with Zoe, Dorothy headed to Skyline's Chicago offices. The tension in the boardroom was thick enough to cut with a knife when she walked in. 12 executives sat around the table, faces grim. Dorothy, said William Taylor, the company's president, we've been dealing with this situation all day. The PR team has prepared a statement. We're offering the flight attendant early retirement with a generous package to avoid any lawsuits. Dorothy placed her notebook on the table. No, that's not how we're handling this. The room fell silent. But Dorothy, William began, this could damage our reputation if. Our reputation should be damaged, Dorothy interrupted, her voice firm but not unkind. Because what happened to me yesterday isn't rare. It's just rare that it happens to someone with the power to do something about it. She opened her notebook and laid out 5 years' worth of observations, detailed notes from dozens of flights she'd taken anonymously on her own airline. This isn't about one flight attendant having a bad day, Dorothy explained. It's about patterns. About who gets helped with their bags and who doesn't. About who gets a warm smile and who gets a cold shoulder. About who feels welcome on our planes and who feels simply tolerated. The executives shifted uncomfortably as Dorothy shared specific examples, dates, flight numbers. But what do you propose? Asked Helen from legal, looking genuinely concerned. We already have anti-discrimination policies and training. Clearly, they're not working, Dorothy replied. She pulled out a folder and handed copies to everyone. This is what we're going to do instead. The plan was bold. A complete overhaul of training. Anonymous testing of service quality by travelers of different backgrounds. Changes to hiring practices. Most surprisingly, Dorothy wanted Renee, the flight attendant who had treated her poorly, to be part of the team developing the new approach. Why her? Gregory asked, puzzled. Because she now understands the problem in a way others might not, Dorothy explained. And because firing her would make this about punishing one person rather than fixing a broken system. William looked skeptical. This will be expensive and disruptive. Dorothy leaned forward. When I started this airline, people told me a black woman couldn't succeed in this industry. That no one would invest in my vision. That I should be content with less. She looked around the table. I didn't listen then, and I'm not listening now. She stood up, her small frame somehow commanding the entire room. We have an opportunity to lead this industry not just in profits, but in dignity. To show other companies that treating people right isn't just good morals, it's good business. She closed her notebook decisively. Now, who's with me? One by one, hands raced around the table. 6 months later, Dorothy stood in front of Skyline's headquarters, watching as workers installed a new sign above the entrance. Dignity in Flight read the gleaming letters, the name of the initiative that had transformed her airline over the past half-year. What do you think? Asked Roy Chen, who had become Dorothy's right-hand man in implementing the changes. It's a good start, Dorothy replied with a small smile. But signs are easy. It's what happens behind them that matters. And much had happened. The training program had been completely rebuilt from the ground up. Every employee, from baggage handlers to pilots, went through new workshops focused not just on rules, but on understanding the human impact of their actions. Most surprising to many was Renee's role in it all. After her tearful apology to Dorothy that day in Chicago, she'd expected to be fired. Instead, Dorothy had offered her a choice: leave the company or help fix it. I don't understand, Renee had said. Why would you want me to stay after how I treated you? Because, Dorothy had explained, you now understand what's at stake in a way others might not. Renee had chosen to stay, and over the months, she'd become one of the most passionate advocates for change. She traveled to every Skyline hub, sharing her story honestly, how biases she hadn't even recognized had affected her behavior, how she treated people differently without even realizing it. I thought I was a good person, she would tell groups of flight attendants during training. And that good people couldn't be prejudiced. I was wrong. We all have blind spots, and the first step is admitting they exist. Today was the official launch of the new Skyline, not just the sign, but a public commitment to a different way of doing business. News crews gathered as Dorothy prepared to address them. Ms. Jenkins, how's it feel to be an internet sensation at 78? Called out a young reporter. Dorothy laughed. Strange, very strange. But if it helps make things better for others, I'll take it. Behind her stood her leadership team, including Gregory Washington and William Taylor. Beside them were new faces, advisors from disability rights groups, cultural sensitivity experts, and regular travelers who'd been invited to join Skyline's new passenger experience board. Ready? Gregory asked as the time approached for her speech. Dorothy nodded, thinking back to that flight 6 months ago. So much had changed since then. Skyline had implemented blind customer satisfaction surveys that weighted economy passengers equally with first class. They'd tied executive bonuses to these scores. They'd created mystery shopper programs, ensuring that passengers of all backgrounds received equal treatment. Early results were promising. Complaints were down 30%. Employee satisfaction had increased. And bookings were up as the public responded positively to an airline that didn't just talk about equality, but actively worked toward it. Dorothy stepped to the microphone, her small frame standing tall. 50 years ago, she began, I was denied a seat on a flight despite having a valid ticket. The gate agent told me there must be some mistake. People like me didn't fly first class. She paused, letting that sink in. That day, I promised myself that someday I would build an airline where everyone was treated with dignity. She gestured to the building behind her. I thought I had done that with Skyline, but 6 months ago, I learned that creating policies isn't enough. Building a truly inclusive company takes constant work, honest conversations, and the courage to change. She turned and motioned Renee forward to join her at the podium. The young woman stepped up nervously. "This is Renee," Dorothy said to the crowd. "She taught me something important, that meaningful change doesn't come from firing people who make mistakes. It comes from giving people the chance to do better." Renee wiped away a tear as she faced the cameras. "Ms. Jenkins didn't just change an airline," she said. "She changed me." As applause rose from the crowd, Dorothy looked out at the faces watching: employees, reporters, travelers. The world was far from perfect. Changing one airline wouldn't fix everything, but it was a start. And at 78, Dorothy Jenkins was still just getting started.